Great. So hello, everyone. Welcome to another NoBeC talk. We are very happy to see you here again. So let's start today's talk. So for today, we will have a very similar agenda than in previous occasions. I will make a very short welcome from the center. Then we will have this week early career researcher, which is Bella Wren from the Wharton School here at UPenn. And then we will have the main talk for today, Dr. Michael Hallsworth from BIT Americas, followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. Just a reminder, as I always do, that this speaker series is organized by our center at Penn, the Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. We are a research center that works to enable organizations around the world to enact positive behavioral change. We work mainly on consulting, research, and training. You can follow us on Twitter following the QR code that you see here, or check our webpage as well if you haven't done it already. And as I always do, I want to share a small piece of news about the work that our center is doing. In this case, it's about next week's event. So we are launching a new working paper series for our center, which will include pre-publication versions of the work that our members are doing around the world. As you probably know, we already have a research page in our main website that includes all our published reports, books, papers, and so on. But now we are adding the working paper series to generate discussion and dissemination of pre-publication materials. Our event is next week on Thursday as well, at the same time at 1 p.m. Eastern time. You can use the same link. You will get reminders as always. It's part of the NoBeC Talk series, so you will see all the information. In the event, we will have a presentation from our director, Professor Cristina Vicari, and then we will have presentations from some of our members speaking about some of the research that we do here, some of the papers that will be included in the series, and so on. It's a very exciting event that we have next week. A few ground rules. If this is the first time that you join, please remember to mute yourself. If you can, keep your camera on so that we have a more interactive experience. If you want, please include your affiliation in your username as well to know where you're joining from. For questions, you can use the chat at any time during the talk. We have a moderator, as always, and then we will have, as I mentioned, 15 minutes for questions and answers, and there you can use the raise hand function or write in the chat as well. And as always, we are transmitting this talk through our Facebook page, and the recording will be available next week on our website. So having said that, I would like to introduce this week's early career researcher. Bella Wren is a PhD student from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and her presentation is called Social Motives for Sharing Conspiracy Theories. If you follow this link or this QR code, you will be able to see the working paper. So let me share the video with you. Great.
Hi everyone, I'm Bella Wren. I'm a second-year doctoral student in the Wharton School, and today I'm excited to share our project on social motives for sharing conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are everywhere, and their influence our attitudes and responses to some of the most common crises such as social systemic science, democratic behaviors, and the pandemic. Therefore, it's both urgent and crucial to understand when and why people are likely to share conspiracy theories. Why do people share conspiracy theories? Some of recent literature suggests that inattentiveness might be one key factor. So here, researchers propose that people care about sharing accurate information and they know that misinformation is inaccurate. However, sometimes they share fake news because they forget to pay attention. Here in our project, we propose a very different account. We postulate that it's true that people want to share accurate information. However, people also want to build social connections when they're communicating. More specifically, we propose that people share information that they know to be untrue in order to build social connections. So for today, I'm going to present you some key takeaways we have for the 3 studies that we ran. In study 1, we surveyed some prolific workers. We presented them with some conspiracy theories and some true news posts and asked about their opinions. What we found was that even when we explicitly reminded participants that true news posts are more accurate than conspiracy theories, people indicated that they will be willing to share conspiracy theories if these conspiracy theories receive a satisfactory number of likes. So what this result suggests is that people will willingly share information that they know to be untrue in order to advance their motivation to build social connections. In study 2 and study 3, people took part in experiments where they make content sharing decisions, and here we're interested in collecting their behavioral responses. For this content sharing decisions, people were presented with some true news posts and some conspiracy theories, and they were asked to choose one of the posts to share with other participants. In study 2, we're interested in studying what do people share when they're motivated to be accurate, what do people share when they're motivated to build social connections. Then in study 3, we want to understand how does social reinforcement change people's content sharing behavior. In study 2, we give people monetary incentive to incentivize different things. What we found was that when people were incentivized to share a piece of accurate information, as you can see in the green bar, almost none of the participants share any conspiracy theories. So what this suggests is that people know what is accurate. Meanwhile, when we incentivize people to share a piece of news that can receive as many comments or as many likes as possible, as you can see in the yellow and the orange bar, almost half of the participants chose to share conspiracy theories. What this suggests is that people expect sharing conspiracy theories to generate more social value. Then in study 3, we asked the question, how does social reinforcement change people's content sharing behavior? So here in this study, people took part in a 5-round interactive post-sharing activity, and we created a post-sharing paradigm that really simulated the actual online social environment that people interact with others. In this paradigm, people choose news to share, and then they're paired with 11 other profiles, which were actually profiles created by us. So on this page, people could like other people's profile, and they will also receive a little notification when somebody else liked their profile. So we randomly assign people into one of the following 3 conditions. For people in the CT reinforcement condition, if they share a conspiracy theory, they receive an above average number of likes, and if they share a piece of true news, they receive a below average number of likes. And this is the opposite in the true news reinforcement condition. And there is no feedback in the control condition. What we found was that people did not change their content sharing behaviors throughout all 5 rounds for the no reinforcement condition. Meanwhile, for the true news reinforcement condition, people directionally decreased their tendency to share conspiracy theories, but this was not a significant decrease. And lastly, for people in the conspiracy theory reinforcement condition, they increased their tendency to share conspiracy theories by almost 100%. What this result suggests is that people are quite sensitive to the social feedback that they receive, and a small social reinforcement, such as the one that we implemented here, can easily shape people's content sharing decisions. In conclusion, our study revealed the following findings. First, people can discern between true news and conspiracy theories. Second, people are willing to trade off accuracy for social connections. And then lastly, when the social rewards are large, people will willingly share conspiracy theories that are known to be untrue. Together, all of these findings reveal important insights into why and when people are particularly likely to share conspiracy theories. And what this finding suggests is that instead of trying to correct the mistaken beliefs of a small subset of people, it might be more effective to change the social incentives related to sharing true news and conspiracy theories. Thank you so much for listening. We welcome any comments, questions, and suggestions.
Great. Thank you so much to Bella for the presentation. I'm sorry about the sound issues. We will upload the video shortly in our website as well, in case you want to review any sections and so on. So as always, unfortunately, we don't have time to do a Q&A with Bella, but I've seen Bella in the audience. So if you'd like to ask any questions or connect or make comments, please feel free to write in the chat. And with that, I would like to present our main speaker for today. As you're aware, the talk for today is called A New Manifesto for Applied Behavioral Science by Dr. Michael Hallsworth. So Dr. Michael Hallsworth is Managing Director North America at the Behavioral Insights team. The BIT was set up by the UK Prime Minister in 2010 as the first government institution dedicated to applying behavioral sciences. And of course, it is now a world-leading organization that helps organizations to apply behavioral science in support of social purpose goals. Michael has been a leading figure in developing the field of applying behavioral science to government. He is the author of the book Behavioral Insights and has authored several influential frameworks such as the Mindspace and EASE report. And his work has been published in, among other outlets, the Journal of Public Economics, The Lancet, the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, and Nature Human Behavior. Michael has a PhD in behavioral economics from Imperial College London and has been previously an assistant professor at Columbia University and a senior policy advisor in the UK Cabinet Office. And finally, of course, Michael is a member of our center and a member of the advisory board of our center as well. So thank you so much, Michael, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for that welcome. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today. Obviously, I'm a big fan of the center. It's great to be following such a fascinating talk. And I see Eugen posted the link to read more about it. So I've tried to share my screen now. I hope everyone can see that, but let me know otherwise. I'm going to talk today about a new manifesto for applying behavioral science. I'm going to try and cover quite a bit. So I imagine there'll be questions. The scope of what I'm talking about here is fairly wide, but I want to give you an overview, and in some instances, I'm going to go into more detail. So bear with me. This is a work in progress as well, and should be taken that way. Very brief introduction to the Behavioural Insights team. As Paula said, it was set up in 2010. We're now a social purpose company. We have over 200 staff in 6 or 7 different countries. We still help organizations to apply findings from behavioral science, design interventions to tackle problems and evaluate the results. I'll be talking at various points about behavioral insights. I'm going to use the definition that we set out in our book, me and Elspeth Kirkman. Hello, can you still hear me?
You're back now.
Zoom seemed to crash there. Sorry, that's very odd. I completely lost Zoom for a second. Can you see my presentation again?
Yeah, we're back on.
Okay, that was very odd. Okay, I'll try and resume where I was. So yeah, an approach that uses evidence of the conscious and non-conscious drivers of human behavior to address practical issues. And there are three components in that kind of definition: using evidence about behavior, a pragmatic application, pragmatic focus, and robust evaluation. So I'm talking here about the applied use of behavioral science. So it's application to real world issues. I think that's an important distinction to make. I'm now going to go through some challenges. I'm going to start by talking about some issues that are often raised in terms of behavioral science that I think should be considered, taken seriously, responded to. I'm not saying that every one of these challenges is correct, may be correct in full, in part, or not at all. But I think it is worth setting some of these out to reflect on them and to kind of understand where I'm coming from here and where the field I think is coming from. One criticism is that behavioral insights has had limited impact. It's focused on more tractable, easy to measure changes at the expense of bigger impact. It's just tinkering around the edges of fundamental problems. Another one is that the approach is very mechanistic. It has a kind of linear and almost simplistic approach to understanding behavior that doesn't think enough about second order effects and spillovers, and kind of has this assumption about moving from A to B against a static background through particularly its use of randomized control trials. Another one, people would say there's a control paradigm. It's an elitist approach, doesn't pay enough attention to people's own goals and motivations, uses concepts like irrationality to justify attempts to control the behavior of individuals, because in that rationale, they lack the means to do so themselves. That it neglects social context. It has a limited, overly cognitive and individualistic view of behavior. It neglects the reality that humans are often embedded in established societies, practices, social networks. It draws on a flawed evidence base. The replication crisis challenges the evidence base and adds to existing concerns like what are the duration of effects, a question that always comes up in talks. I'm going to keep going. There's a lack of precision. Even taking this evidence base into account, behavioral insights lacks the ability to construct precise interventions, establish what works for who and when. It either relies on overgeneral frameworks or disconnected lists of biases. It's overconfident. It's affected by a wider issue of being too sure in its recommendations, although this caveat, obviously there's an emphasis on testing. And it can over-extrapolate from its evidence base when testing is not an option in particular. It's failed to reach scale. It promotes a model of experimentation followed by scale up, but hasn't paid enough attention to how successful scaling happens. And in fact, that it doesn't happen often. And also that it's kind of focused on application over innovation. It's focused on, if you like, on the exploitation of existing findings, say applying a certain concept of social norms to different contexts, rather than kind of exploration that looks for a deeper understanding of how social norms function. And I know this is a topic that will be obviously very close to various experts in this call right now. And arguably that means there's a lack of innovation in the applied use of behavioral science in recent years. Okay, so I've gone through various challenges. I think it is important to be aware of them. There's one more. Ethical concerns. There'll be increasing ethical dilemmas around transparency and privacy as behavioral insights attempts more ambitious and innovative work, particularly around more tailored interventions. So I want to point out that these are ones that, as a practitioner, I'm aware of and I take seriously and I think about, and also think the field should. I'm not saying they're all true, but I think there are ways that the field should develop and respond and move on. In fact, I'm going to say that, after a decade of I say the current phase of applied behavioral science. We're not, of course, saying that that no behavioral science informed policy before nudge, clearly not. But in this current kind of phase, I think we need a new manifesto to address some of these challenges and guide our practices. And I want to emphasize that what I'm about to talk about is a work in progress, and there are some areas I'll be talking about in more detail than others. You can see the work in progress. My animation has done something odd. I'm going to just bring up the 10 principles in this manifesto on one slide here. So these are the constituent parts, the proposals of the manifesto. First one, I'm just going to read them out for now and then try and explain some of them. Use behavioral science as a lens rather than as a specialist tool. See the system. Put RCTs in their place. And I should point out that I'm being deliberately provocative in some of these titles. Be humble or an enable. There's no view from nowhere. Predict and adjust. Replication, not inflation. Move beyond lists of biases. Data science for equity. And build behavioral science into organizations. I'm going to talk in more depth about 3 of these topics. Let's go through the other ones fairly quickly. I'm going to talk first about using behavioral science as a lens. The argument here, I'm kind of starting with the premise that actually the strengths that brought success for behavioral science may also be holding it back. So when BIT was set up in the wake of nudge, there was a pressing need to demonstrate clear results and build credibility. And that pressure led us and others to create similar processes for developing interventions. I'm going to show this kind of on the slides. We have this pressure, saying, does any of this actually work outside the laboratory? Does it have real world effects? And indeed, is this a good use of, say, taxpayer money? Well, to answer those questions in the best way we could, you then focus on testing. You develop a kind of a systematic approach to creating interventions. At BIT, we have one called tests. There are many of these that have very similar stages. Early processes, though, tend to point you towards, if you like, downstream interventions that concern how specific aspects of policy, product, or service are designed. And they usually focus on discrete behaviors by actors, considered mostly in isolation. The issue here is then there's some element of self-reinforcement. People start thinking, the fact that these processes are very strong and produce clear and credible results, and there's a lot more they can do, also means that it can become self-fulfilling, that people start to think this is the only way that behavioral science can and should be applied. And perception shapes demand. So only certain kinds of problems can be seen as ones that are suitable for behavioral scientists. And there's a kind of narrowing as a result. I think there's a need for a bit of a rebalancing. Now, it is not immensely new news to say that behavioral science also has much to say about broader, larger issues in society. Take the economy, for example. Behavioral science can show how to regulate markets differently, how to use taxes to drive wider behavioral changes. And in fact, at BIT, we've also put out this vision for a behavioral economy as a whole. There's a report we did called the Behavioral Economy. Now, this is something that we've talked about since our creation. We have talked about this broader vision. But the self-limiting factors that I kind of mentioned before have also been quite strong. So I think now we're in a position where do something about this. Otherwise, behavioral science may not actually fulfill its potential. So how can we change the field itself. That's the kind of question of the manifesto. And each of the proposals in the manifesto, in a way, is trying to address that question. So the first one, in terms of behavioral science as a lens, is about changing the metaphor we use, frame through which we see applied behavioral science itself. And this is, if you like, a fairly modest one to start with, and I'm going to talk about more, precise and actionable things. But I think this one is important. I think, and we've been saying this for some time, this implicit metaphor of behavioral science as like a specialist tool that is used only for certain types of problems. That's a behavioral problem, and that's not. So we need the behavioral tool to apply to it. Instead, behavioral science should be understood as a lens that improves your view of any public and private action rather than a tool we sometimes pick up. Doing this, I think, allows us to realize that we can't separate out behavioral and non-behavioral issues, and therefore evidence about behavior should be integrated into an organization's key activities rather than being this kind of optional extra. It reveals that behavioral science complements traditional approaches to influencing behavior, allows you to enhance them rather than just being an alternative to them, helps you see the behavioral dimension of an approach or issue. And I think, obviously, the emphasis on nudge has been incredibly powerful and helpful. But I think also it has made people think that behavioral science is an alternative to, if you like, more mainstream or traditional policy options. And it's not just about creating new interventions. That's why I don't talk about language of behavior change, because it may be that you're looking to maintain a behavior or stop a behavior. Or it may be actually using this lens to say that you shouldn't act at all, that government shouldn't introduce a policy, or that it's actually having unintended effects from current actions. And this is the wider, kind of more flexible understanding that I think is quite important. And also points towards more emphasis on the diagnosis of a situational issue, rather than pushing too soon to define a precise kind of target outcome up front. And we have this framework called tests, and the first letter is about target. But does that actually narrow down things too much? If you think about it takes you to precision too quickly. Why do metaphors matter? Well, because the task of kind of broadening the application of behavioral science is as much a political one as an intellectual one. If you're talking about applied behavioral science, it's about the place it has in organizations and who pays attention. So you could argue that this idea of a tool has established the credibility and acceptance for behavioral science in a defined area. But actually what we need now is to expand beyond that area, allowing behavioral science to fulfill its potential before this kind of self-reinforcing cycle becomes too hard to break. That's the idea of behavioral science as a lens and thinking about the metaphors. Take you to the second kind of proposal, which is about seeing the system. About complex adaptive systems a bit. And there is quite often a problem when you do this. You talk about complex problems, complex adaptive systems, and it seems that what you're saying is, everything's complex. It's just difficult. You're just kind of adding an element of, it's all very difficult. You should think about that. That's not my point here. My point is that when you think about complex adaptive systems, you're talking about a specific way of analyzing, understanding collective behavior, which has certain principles, which you then can use to do things better, to structure policies better. It's not just a kind of counsel of despair. So I just said that this, if you like, the standard process around developing behavioral science interventions is quite linear. But the issue is that major policy challenges are generally taking place in a complex adaptive system. And people often refer to the way that like a complex adaptive system produces wicked problems. And the COVID-19 pandemic is quite a good example of this, in the sense of the different aspects of a wicked problem it has. So you have contested ideas of success. There's disagreement about the overall goals of how you respond to the pandemic. Are you talking about suppression, elimination, buying time until vaccines arrive, or just letting people, giving people maximum freedom, let alone consensus on how to achieve those goals? There are nonlinear outcomes. The initial coronavirus variant is what we call, what epidemiologists call over-dispersed. So there are outbreaks were generally kind of created by a handful of super spreading events. 80% of infections caused by 10% of individuals. Many people did not pass the virus on at all. Therefore, you have this kind of non-linear movement whereby, you know, one person not going to a particular event could stop a massive outbreak, whereas one person going to a different event has no effect. And unintended consequences. So the fact that mitigation actions have had indirect effects. I'm not saying these mitigation actions were wrong in any way, but it is worth being aware of them and that these processes are taking place. So if you do have situations where a lot of the policy challenges are taking place in complex systems, the problem is that, as one article recently put it, there are fewer examples of behavioral insights applied to understanding behavior in complex change processes. And why is that? Well, the realities of complex adaptive systems kind of challenge the main assumptions underlying the dominant approach, which, you know, involves a tight focus on a target behavior, has some assumptions, not all the time, but some assumptions of linearity and some assumptions of stability. I'm just going to explain those. Okay, I would do. This is slightly tricky because the animation of my slide has done something very odd. Okay, I'm going to just talk you through what's on the slide, even though you can't see all of it. So basically, the tight focus on the target behavior, you know, is about focusing on a measurable target behavior, and that is your focus, okay? And there's been less consideration about effects away from that main kind of target area. But we can't actually assume that those effects will happen in a linear way. Sorry, those effects will be contained to the behavior you're looking at. There'll be wider effects, and there are many such examples of these unintended consequences. So, for example, there was an instance in the US where there was an attempt to reduce fraud by grocery stores participating in a government voucher scheme. That attempt to reduce fraud was successful, but it also led to many stores no longer stocking the foods as a result, the high nutrient foods that were needed in those areas. So ultimately backfiring and harming participants' diets. There was a trade-off that was invisible. If you just focus on reducing fraud, you don't see the wider impacts on behavior. Linear effects, we kind of assume that there is a theory of change in interventions, but we may actually be in a situation where you're not having any apparent effects because in the system, there are some actors that are compensating for what you're actually doing. So you may be kind of, say you're pushing in one direction, well, there's an unseen factor that you're not aware of that is absorbing your pressure, and so it looks like you're not having any effect. And on the other hand, you can have a small amount of pressure and suddenly there's a large change because the system was actually on the edge of stability, as we call it. And you see this all the time where an apparently minor event can trigger, say, a coup in a country. The point is, if you assume linearity, you may assume your intervention has failed, for example, but in fact that change is happening through other routes. And finally, this idea of stability, the idea that you have point A and point B and you intervene, you move from point A to point B, and everything else remains stable, and you measure the impact. But actually, it may be that your intervention changes the nature of the situation itself. Your intervention may your success may be about how well you adapt to the unanticipated changes your action has produced. So this is pretty complicated. I'm going through it fairly quickly. The readout is that there's a kind of irony here, that we, perhaps as behavioral scientists, are using some heuristics ourselves based on linear models of change when confronted with complexity. And there's a paper that's quite nice called The Reductive Tendency on this. You simplify a complex system into a cognitively manageable representation. And the result potentially is an illusion of control. So we overestimate impacts from interventions, particularly at high level in terms of policy, because of our inaccurate mental models. So it's quite sobering that you could argue that behavioral scientists should be thinking that they themselves are, if you like, demonstrating some of these ideas that they identify in others. So what do we do about this?
Michael, quick question. There was a
Yes.
clarification in the audience.
Yes.
Whether you could share, could you share like an example of linear effects from BIT's work?
Sorry, the linear effects is in...
Yeah.
Oh, right, as in... oh, yeah, so, well, this would be something like... I'm assuming you mean linear rather than non-linear effects. So the linear effects would be something you see in like a theory of change. So you say, a very simple example, sending a text message to remind somebody of an upcoming appointment will then mean that they remember that the appointment is taking place, and they will they're more likely to turn up. Example of non-linear effects is, say, text messages to parents reminding them of a certain event that their child is meant to attend. Any of these parents forward the text to each other and say, actually, we're not sure this event is appropriate. Then there's a movement to have the event cancelled, and the event never happens. That would be, for example, an unexpected or non kind of linear effect. So the assumption of linearity is you have a theory of change, and one thing leads to another in a kind of logically and explicable and anticipatable way. That's my kind of quick answer. So what should we do about this? So I think there is an opportunity to develop behavioral science so it can tackle aspects of complexity that are common to major policy issues. So let's remind ourselves why we're talking about this. If there's this desire to go upstream and have more than limited impact, well, one thing you have to confront is the complexity of the situation. The first thing I want to talk about is this idea of small changes can have a big impact. Now, this phrase is often used in the sense that minor features of a situation can have a surprisingly large effect on behavior. And that is in line with the kind of standard linear approach of do a specific isolated change and you define the behavior you're measuring, look at the results. But I think this is actually true, this statement, in a different way. I've made a really bad diagram to try and show how. So the idea here is that actually upstream and downstream don't really make much sense. So you can have features of a system, so you can have different ways that people behave, which look like fairly minor shifts. So slightly differently, and actually that is bundled up into a whole set of other changes. Change develops and actually then goes to a high level and influences the whole system. This is what we call emergence. So small changes can actually emerge, build up, and actually affect the whole system. Let me give you an example for COVID again. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, you can see people trying to achieve their goals within a broad set of rules set by governments and in response to changing events. And these are kind of adaptive behaviors. But these adaptive behaviors also interacted with the fact that viruses mutate. So new variants of the virus emerged. The fact that these behavioral choices meant that overall new variants emerged and were transmitted, that changed the whole nature of the game. The Delta variant, for example. The course of the pandemic was changed because that emerged and changed the nature of the game, even though it actually was at the start quite a low-level mutational shift. So the point being here that social norms, rules, mental models, culture itself can emerge from aggregated social interactions. And then they, in turn, shape cognition and behavioral patterns at a high level. And that's why this kind of upstream versus downstream, or high level versus low level distinction is actually perhaps not very helpful when you think about complex systems. Instead, there's this idea of cross-scale behaviors, where behaviors embedded in certain contexts, shaped by a system, can self-organize, can emerge to shape the system itself. Let's get practical about this. What's the kind of readout from this? Well, you could use behavioral science to identify these kind of leverage points where there is the possibility to nudge behavior in a way that produces wider system effects. This could be done, for example, at stages of random fluctuations. And you see this at the start where people are still getting used to how things are playing out, where, if you like, things are up for grabs. There are various experiments that show this, that there's an initial stage of organization where things could go one way or the other, where people are still trying to, the apparently small decisions that take place at that stage have much bigger consequences. They set up structures that then become locked in. Identify where tipping points in the system, this sudden change may be about to occur, and either nudge them to occur or not, depending on the policy goals. There are limitations, though, to looking at tipping points. They're difficult to identify, so you may be maybe an inefficient way of doing it. But also, what about influencing the system to get to a tipping point in the first place? That is really interesting. The reason why, this is why I think the big contribution can come, because in a complex system, although the connections between people produce complexity, produce lots of different unexpected events and so on, but the individual actors in that system are often using a core set of simple rules to guide their behavior. And if there's one thing that behavioral science has studied, is simple rules, heuristics to guide behavior. So you can see then a kind of fused approach between complexity and behavioral science, which is about providing evidence, not assumptions, about how people use heuristics to guide their interactions in a system, to study the collective implications of those heuristics, to show how they play out against the governing conditions and structures of a system, and then change the parameters of that system to make it more likely the desired behaviors will emerge. And you can see some early stages of this happening in some work. So there's an interesting paper around, in macroeconomics, you have certain models of the world based mostly on rational actor models. But you can see this paper, which just came out, starts thinking about what if households are using some simple rules about copying how much they save from others. What effect would that have at a macro level? And it shows some interesting things around, they talk about sudden transitions from one type of economy to the other, certain amounts of inequality that are produced through the aggregated actions of households using simple heuristics. Because, you would say, oh, we've got heuristics and they drive system level behavior. What we should do is try and directly influence what heuristics people are using and how they're using them. So, in this instance, create an intervention to change the way that households are learning about savings from each other. Sure, but maybe a better way would be harness the power of the system to make targeted change in, say, one of its features that drives wider effects, creates the conditions for larger shifts in behavior to occur. To be a bit specific about this, social media. So there are some papers, which I'll cite in the final report, that talk about how a shift in the ease of sharing information on social media arguably had quite a big impact on events like the Arab Spring developing. There's a line in a paper that came out recently about this topic, talking about changes to a few lines of code can impact global behavioral processes, given, for example, the reliance on social media networks. But equally, we did work in the UK on sugar drinks tax, which is all about organizing structure of a taxation system, changing one aspect of it, so it was a tiered system that incentivized reformulation of drinks to reduce sugar. And that changing the parameters away from a flat tax to a tiered tax drove changes in the market, geared the market towards health, towards reduced sugar in the market. And that's why I think this really interesting kind of cross-scale behaviors can make a difference, the way that behaviors aggregate and interact with the way a market is regulated. And yet there's a broader change in perspective needed if you take this seriously. You can't just think about launching interventions in isolation and then moving on when your narrowly defined goal has been achieved. Instead, you need to be thinking about the longer term impact on the system of a collection of different policies with varying goals. I've talked about in the past this idea of system stewardship, which I think is really relevant here. It's a way of harnessing the power of a complex adaptive system without saying that you can control it. And it's worth saying that obviously not every problem that behavioral scientists will be facing involves complex adaptive systems. So the stand back kind of lesson here, which is why it's called See the System, is understand the type of system we're dealing with in behavioral science and choose an approach accordingly. If you're dealing with a relatively simple, clear situation, then a more linear approach and an RCT that measures a specific outcome will be appropriate. But if you're dealing with a complex system, try and understand that in detail. Try and understand what's going on here. I'm now going to sort of conclude, I think, by talking about behavioral science in organizations and sort of leave some of these other topics for the Q&A. One of which I wanted to highlight briefly was predicting and adjusting, which is basically around the idea that as a field, we should be trying to predict in advance what impacts interventions are going to have, and then revisiting those predictions afterwards to see if they have been, to see how accurate they were. And the reason for this is we know that hindsight bias is very powerful. After an event, a result seems obvious, and we can come up with reasons why. But if we don't do specific predictions, we may therefore become overconfident in our ability to understand or predict behavior. We may have thought, oh, of course, we thought this all along. And I wanted to highlight there is some really great work being done, including by Eugen and others, to ask practitioners to predict the outcomes of interventions and then feed that back. And I think this should become kind of standard practice in the future for our field. So I'm going to talk finally about building behavioral science into organizations. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I think the debate in this area is, well, first of all, this is a really important issue, because you could argue that this is the key to scaling. Building behavioral science into organizations is the way to achieve scale, really. But the debate has been a lot around, how you should set up how behavioral insights can have more influence within organizations. How do you set up a behavioral science function in an organization? So I think this is important because there's been less attention on how behavioral science can be integrated into an organization's own processes. So to clarify what I mean here, think about it this way. It's about applying the lens of behavioral science to redesign organizational processes, rather than saying, how do we get a behavioral science function in an organization? And there are many ways you can do this. There are many opportunities to redesign organizational processes with behavioral science in mind. You can minimize administrative burdens, remove sludge. You can build in pre-mortems and forecasting mechanisms. You can introduce greater feedback to people's processes as standard. And we actually have a whole report on this called Behavioural Government, about how you can rethink, in particular, policy making. So again, there has been less focus on this idea of, for example, the way budgets are made, as opposed to how an organization is using the budget, and how that behavioral science can inform, how do I put this? There's been less about how you integrate behavioral science into organizational designs itself. And I think this is really important, not only because, as I mentioned, it's a way to achieving scale in a sustainable way, but it is also resilient to changes in the demand for behavioral science solutions. So if there's a future when people stop saying, oh, let's get a behavioral scientist in here to advise on this issue, that would be okay if the organization has actually integrated principles of behavioral science into the way it functions. So here's how I think you could combine the two kind of ways of thinking about behavioral science in organizations in this diagram I'm showing you. So on the left-hand side, the vertical axis is a very crude representation of whether an organization has tried to apply behavioral science to shape its processes. And that's what I've been talking about there. So in very broad terms, like if you have on the side the yes row, then there's some element of having integrated behavioral science principles into business as usual. And I'll build on this in a second, but just to get the very basic concept clear. In the row above that, that hasn't happened, okay? And then in terms of the columns, these relate to some of the choices that people talk about in terms of how do you organize behavioral science knowledge and capacity in your organization. And in the limited column, there's very limited or little support or awareness for behavioral science concepts in the organization. So there's been very limited kind of investment in talking or thinking about behavioral science. In the centralized column, there's a setup where there's a dedicated team or resource that applies behavioral science to organizational issues. And in the diffused column, people with familiarity or competence in behavioral science are spread throughout the organization. Now, to make this clear, when the current debate often thinks in terms of which column should we choose? Consider the rows here. To what extent have you built behavioral science into business as usual? And I think this gives you a better understanding of what we're talking about. So to take these kind of sections in turn, the baseline one is a situation where there's very limited awareness of behavioral science in an organization. Its principles are not incorporated into processes. So the benefits are likely to be limited here. In what nudged organization, and again, the terminology is up for grabs here. Well, so levels of behavioral science awareness are still low, but its principles have been used to redesign processes to produce better outcomes for staff or service users or customers. For example, planning processes may include mandatory pre-mortems to reduce overconfidence. Application processes may have been simplified to increase completion rates. There may still be low-hanging fruit here, recognizing that some of these changes will require more substantial investment, like training staff to adopt new interview approaches. But it's not like a conscious use of behavioral science. And that's, I suppose, why I was using the nudged organization language. In the proactive consultancy box, this is the situation where leaders have set up a centralized behavioral team, but perhaps not given much thought to supporting organizational changes. So the team then, the kind of, if you like, nudge unit within an organization has to work in an enterprising way, looking for opportunities, how to prove its worth. And this is the reality for many teams. So in this situation, trying to get upstream influence or wider buy-in is kind of a political endeavor. How do you position yourself as being useful? And the problem here is you may not be in a very resilient position because you're not really grafted into the standard processes of the organization as much. You have to continually kind of prove your worth. And leaders may have unrealistic expectations about what you can do. In the call for the experts model, there is still centralized behavioral expertise, but there are also prompts and resources that allow it to be integrated more into business as usual. So at its simplest, this might mean that standard processes introduce a prompt for staff to recognize that, okay, now we need some centralized expertise on behavior. For example, like any new requirement in an application process needs to be assessed for its likely effects on behavior. Call for the experts. At another level, the organization may have invested to ensure the ability to randomize has been built into new and existing delivery systems. So teams can run experiments when, the centralized team can run experiments when they're called on. And if working well, the setup would mean that, there's these integrated processes stimulate demand for behavioral expertise that then a centralized team fulfills. In the behavioral entrepreneur situation, there is behavioral science capacity distributed throughout the organization, either through direct capacity building or recruitment. The problem is that organizational processes, they don't support these individual pockets of knowledge. Instead, those with expertise are forced to act as individual entrepreneurs, if you like, but they find it hard to apply ideas in practice, evaluate their effects, share findings, and build learning. And so instead, they may find themselves rubbing against misguided processes and become disillusioned. And then finally, this behaviorally informed organization. I should say we are a bit as part of the Rotman School's Behaviorally Informed Organization Partnership that's working on these issues. And Dilip Soman has recently published a book with this title. I'm using this language, which feels appropriate, to describe a situation where there's knowledge of behavioral science diffused throughout the organization, which also has processes to set up the application of that knowledge. And arguably, this is the most resilient setup. Staff will be applying behavioral science in a deliberate way as part of business as usual. And institutional support would allow a more coherent approach. But this would also require the most investment, but also the greatest opportunity for scale and sustainability. So the overriding message here is for kind of greater focus on the organizational changes that indirectly apply or support behavioral science principles, rather than just thinking about how the direct and overt use of behavioral science can be promoted in an organization. I think this really lays the groundwork for both scale and sustainability. So I wanted to stop there. I've only been able to touch on a few of these concepts. There are others that are equally as important, but which I think don't fit into a 45-minute talk. Stay easy. We know a gap often emerges between intentions and behavior. So we're going to be focused as an organization on bridging this gap in the coming years. And indeed, this manifesto will be part of a new collection of resources that we'll be putting out to start to fulfill the ambitions that we talk about in this manifesto. So I'm very interested in your kind of thoughts. If you tweet at me or email me, I'd be very happy to kind of engage in this. Thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Great, Michael. Thanks so much. So we have some time for Q&A. If you would like to maybe keep your slides up, so maybe some people have questions about some of those.
Yeah, sure.
Let me kick off with something. So first of all, I think it's amazing to have you present it this way by starting with the challenges and the downsides of behavioral science. I think most most talks on behavioral science start with this amazing opportunity and everything that's possible, and it seems so, unlimited resources and whatnot. I think your manifesto will be an amazing contribution to that field because it actually focuses on the challenges and what needs to be changed. So let me press you on maybe some more precise policy recommendations, which is a common sort of thread in your whole talk was this: we need to pay attention to potential spillovers and backfiring. And I agree with that completely, because I think there's so much emphasis on let's fix behavior A that we don't pay attention enough to what actually happens to other behaviors and spillovers and backfires and all of that. Now, a lot of these things can only be evaluated ex post, right? So we introduce an intervention and then we see what happens, and then we say, oh, that's a bummer. So a bunch of people are worse off. So it's definitely not a Pareto improvement. What would you say is sort of an important way forward to really make sure that we anticipate potential issues? You sort of laid out a couple of concepts. What do you think do we need to do, companies, policymakers, behavioral scientists, to really avoid making things worse for a subpopulation and anticipate these challenges?
So there are a few different things. They broadly fall into the anticipating and responding categories. So in the anticipating categories, I think there is more we can do to anticipate some of these effects. I'm not saying we can anticipate everything. That's clearly not true. But for example, when you're setting up an RCTs, there's an interesting idea that you should, as well as think about your logic model, you should be thinking about your dark logic model. And there's a paper from about 5 years ago talking about dark logic, which tries to think about the harm that may ensue as a kind of mental exercise. It is like a premortem in some senses, but my point is that a lot of the incentives are to not think about those things. So there are some, if you can introduce some kind of reliable prompts into processes, that would be helpful. That's easier said than done. I think I also talk about, not in this talk, but in the paper, around the use of modeling, agent-based modeling, as another way of thinking about likely effects, and indeed to make the argument that behavioral science can improve agent-based modeling, which tends to rest on certain assumptions around the rational actor model. So I think there's an interesting kind of push and pull there. And then the second category of things is around responding when to emerging issues. And that's something that perhaps doesn't happen so much. It can be a problem in terms of RCTs, but I talk in the paper around some options to build greater flexibility into your evaluation. Kevin Volpe and other authors have talked about evolutionary RCTs. There are things called SMART trials, sequential multiple attribution randomized trial, I think it's called, where you can switch and adapt the setup as it goes on. So I think there's one of the first stages around responding is just trying to get a wider range of feedback on how things are playing out in the real world and what effects are happening. And that can't just be whatever you've pre-specified.
Yeah, great. I mean, I was happy to see that you used one of the figures from our joint work, right, on the forecasting, and it seems that you perceive that as sort of the future of, doing like proper behavioral science, anticipating the right interventions. Our paper in a way is good news, right? It shows that academics and practitioners can actually anticipate much better what works and what doesn't than sort of lay people. I've seen now Colin Camera, Anna Dreba, and like a bunch of people are now doing these prediction markets to choose which papers to select to then replicate, right? So you sort of use common knowledge to select which papers should be replicated because potentially they fail to replicate. So I agree. I think this type of idea of using, sort of common knowledge and common perception is, it can also apply sort of to this issue. We have a comment or a question in the audience. I'm going to read that out. Isha asks, how do we strike a balance between applying behavioral science to internal processes and applying it to external business-facing problems?
I mean, I think that balance has to, it depends what your goals are. So is your goal to address an organization's priorities and thereby establish yourself more firmly in an organization to then have wider impact. Because then you should be guided by your political sense of what is likely to achieve that in an organization. And certainly, speaking from experience, the first thing that people look at is external, the purpose of this explicit purpose of an organization. First of all, conversation about internal processes, that is difficult. Like, that's taken a long time. It's always difficult to raise it in a public policy space. That's something what I found. And the incentives are often not aligned to look internally. It may vary between organizations. If you have somebody who's focused on internal processes and has a real incentive to improve functioning, then it can happen quickly. In my experience, people are more reluctant to actually apply behavioral science internally, but I may be biased by my experience with the public sector.
Great, thank you. We have a next question, which is related to something I would have asked next as well. So you might know there's this 2017 NBR working paper by John List where they sort of do an overview of nudge interventions, and then they sort of look at follow-ups and sort of the persistency of effects. And they see that many of these initial interventions don't really show any long-lasting effects subsequently, right? And most studies, honestly, don't even do follow-ups, right? So as you know, many studies that do a one-shot intervention and then they measure the behavior and then they leave the site, and we don't even know how prolonged these effects are, right? So the question in the audience, in a way, is, how long, like, do you have any sort of idea as to how, first of all, how long-lasting effects are? Maybe how can we improve the long-lastingness of effects? And also what needs to be sort of done in the future in behavioral science to really sort of make behavioral change stick. And maybe you have some stories from BIT where you looked at unintended consequences and whether they sort of stick. So yeah, any insight from applied work?
Yeah. So first quick answer is we talk about this in the book in some depth. Well, it's a short book. We talk about this issue in the book. So it's worth looking at what we say there. I think it's really difficult to answer this one because I think there is just there's a real variability in the amount of information that's available. And to unpack what I mean here, the incentives are to move on and not look at the long-term effects. And this goes to my point about the kind of system stewardship argument that you should be looking at aggregate effect of interventions. So it really, like, our knowledge about this is very much governed by chance, what the ones that people have decided to pay more attention to over time. Because you do see some things that are surprising in terms of the duration of the effects, like an apparently very small effect lasting over a long time. And there was one in the back of my mind that I saw recently that I found quite surprising, that you would expect it to decay in some ways, and it just hasn't. But I don't know if for every time I see that, there are 50 where there has been a decay in effect. So I'm just reflecting on the state of our own knowledge here, that it's not full, and there is a real bias in what we actually know. I can't give, if the question is around how long does it last, we have to design and implement a follow-up intervention, it's almost impossible to give you a duration there. What I can give you is what goes into trying to make an answer to that question. Because I've seen habituation. I've seen decay of effects, and I've seen effects that are integrated into a steady environment and therefore have very long-term effects. Can't tell you how likely each of those things are. or how prevalent?
Yeah, let me just quick follow up to this. And I agree with everything that you said. Do you believe that partially the challenge with long-lasting effects comes from the fact that many of these behavioral interventions are meant to create different types of sort of best responses to, the new environment, to the incentive that you set? You don't actually change people's perception of what's right and wrong, or not necessarily always, right? You don't really change their perspective of what should be done differently. They're just maybe cognitively lazy now, and they just go with this new layout of, whatever environment you create. And the moment you take that away, people just go back to sort of their original behavior. I think so. Christina had to drop out, but Christina sort of makes the point that this, in a way, is almost the difference between changing behavior through nudging and changing norms, like collective norms, because that really makes you rethink the situation and really, change your perspective of what's right or wrong. So do you believe that maybe nudging often and behavioral interventions in general are a bit, short in how they change the underlying mechanisms, and they just change sort of the response to the implemented mechanism?
Sorry, I don't know if that was a question or I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we have one more question. Caroline asks, is it possible that movement from behavioral science as a specialist tool to a lens will depend on its maturity in that context? In building capacity and trying to build its use and policy in certain countries, it may be hard to move straight to lens. Might take time, ?
I think that's a really good point. Yes, I think that's a good point. And I think that the reason why I should make that point in the report. I've been trying to think about the future as well. So it may be that reality is nearer for some places or some contexts than others. But I hope that all the contexts will be there at some point. So, if you're setting out a kind of a goal, I think, yes, it's true that it may take, the journey to get there will be of variable duration.
Great. By the way, I just mentioned in the chat that I had the comment that I previously made. I made the same comment about, difference between norms and nudges with Richard Taylor, and he didn't agree. In his view, nudging and norm change is all the same. And so I'm happy to sort of have you sort of on our side, right? So.
Well, actually, I didn't know whether I agreed with you on that specific point. I have to say, sorry to cause a problem here, but I actually wasn't sure if that was true. I think it might be a false distinction. I'm sure you need to make that distinction, but anyway, we should talk about that another time.
Great. Yeah.
I need to think about it.
All right. So we are at sort of the deadline. Paulius, is there anything that you would like to voice?
No, I guess to thank you all for attending. And as I just wrote in the chat, please remember that next week we have the launch of our working paper series. I've shared a link where you can find more information. And yeah, thank you so much, Michael, for the great presentation, and Bella as well, and Oikon for the moderation. And yeah, see you next time.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Thanks.
And Bella.